It's cold out, and you want a warm soup that's easy, delicious, and most importantly, low-carb and keto-friendly. And so, Caldo Gallego fits the bill. This soup from Galicia, located in the northwestern region of Spain, begins with ham. Since he's making a medium potful, this dinner slice works best. You could leave the ham whole until later in the process, however, Dennis prefers to cut it into bite-sized pieces from the beginning. Then he requires a decently sized stock pot that can fit large things. This regular-sized pot cannot. Once the ham is added to the pot, it's time to move on to another meat. Salt pork. Ideally, this chunk of meat would be whole, however, he couldn't find any, so this sliced variant will suffice. If you can't find salt pork, bacon is a valid substitution. Then it's time for the basis of life on Earth, water. He adds clean filtered water to the pot until it covers the meat, and then some. There are no measurements because this soup is cooked by feel, not to be confused with the feelings. The pot is placed over high heat and brought to a boil. While he waits for the evaporation stage, he turns his attention to another key ingredient, turnips. These cousins of the radish are the replacement for potatoes in the traditional Caldo Gallego. Although they lack the starch to thicken the soup, they are an amazingly delicious alternative. He removes their stems and with the aid of a vegetable peeler, gets to work on the thickish outer skin. However, his first turnip has a bit of a special spice. Floor spice. He gives it a good clean and moves onwards. Moving in concentric fashion, he makes quick work of the purple layer, using his knife for any difficult to reach remnants. But these turnips must be cut into smaller pieces. First he begins by cutting his root across its horizontal plane. Then he places cuts at roughly a centimeter apart that do not slice the entire piece. He rotates and cuts the same distance apart, and then cuts into smaller pieces. He breaks apart any pieces that may still be conjoined and adds them to a large container. Again, he knows no measurement. He decides to use a tiny elf shovel his mom got him for the Christmas holiday. Making short work of the turnips, he moves on to the next meat, Spanish chorizo. He slices 2 chorizos into medium-sized medallions. These are added into the same vessel as his turnips as they will become ferns, and added to the soup at the same time. Checking on his broth, it's begun to boil, evident by the fact he can't see. Using a large spoon and a trash receptacle, he skims the foamy scum from the top of the soup, and discards it. With water still boiling, it's time for beef flank steak. This decently sized piece weighs roughly an imperial pound and a half, not quite a kilogram. The beef is gently lowered into its hot bath and the pot mostly covered. Then he cleans, because that's. An hour later he returns to check on his meat broth. The flank steak has become rather fork tender, and thus he can now add his turnips and the chorizo. The turnips will not break down, however they will become soft. They simply need time to cook. You could eventually use an immersion blender to make a sort of puree with the turnips. However, he finds that too difficult. He places the lid and sets a timer for 60 minutes, long enough for a battle of wits. In despair, he turns his attention to his greenery, collard greens. Initially outwitted by a rubber band, he eventually begins to pull off stems, or fronds, or leaves, or whatever the name by the scientific and culinary communities. Once he has a decent bushel of leaves, he takes them to the sink to wash, but changes his mind and decides to tidy them before rinsing. Using an incredibly sharp paring knife, he runs the blade down both sides of the stem. The stem is discarded while the leaves are set aside. This action is not necessary, but it makes the greens much easier and more pleasurable to eat. One must also be cautious of how the knife lays. Luckily, this recipe for disaster is avoided. Once the greens have been alleviated from their backbones, he whacks in batches to rinse them under cold water. They are set aside on a plastic board so his wooden one doesn't absorb the water. A sure sign it's time to oil his board. Then he discovers the stems and his imagination ignites.
A little carried away.
A little carried away, indeed, and the mess is substantial. After cleaning the stems throughout his kitchen, it's time to tend to his soup. After an hour of cooking, his turnips have become soft, just as he desires. Now, using his hands to tear up the collard greens, he throws a hefty amount of the shrub into the soup. This is one of the reasons you need a large pot. If the soup has thickened or evaporated too much, simply add more water. He gives the greens a stir and covers the soup once more. Then a timer is set for 15 minutes, just enough to let the greens cook. In the meantime, he chats with his friends on the blacktiekitchen Discord channel. Once time has run out, it's time to eat. Traditionally, the meats are removed from the soup and set aside to cool. This allows those enjoying the soup to pick and choose their favorite cuts. He fails to extract all the ham and salt pork, but he does drain as much broth as possible. If you are the person that eats all the chorizo, you. You are no longer invited. Back at the board, he shreds some of the flank steak and adds it to his bowl, along with a few slices of chorizo. Then with a healthy serving of broth, it's time to eat. The perfect soup for a cold winter day that's easy and incredibly delicious.
Oh my gosh. And what's the secret? No spices.
No spices, indeed. No matter how you make this soup, it's guaranteed to feel like a warm hug. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to watch how to make a soup from the opposite side of the world, ramen. I'll see you there. Until next time, eat well.